If you've ever thought, wouldn't it be cool to host my own GitHub-like service? Well, you've come to the right place. Today, we're setting up a project called Forgejo in an LXC running on top of Proxmox. I'll show you how to connect it to your Tailnet so that you can access your repositories from anywhere in the world, including a seamless way to expose SSH for clone operations using just a couple of lines of code in your Tailscale configuration. Now let me get this out of the way up front. I need to apologize for my dreadful pronunciation of the word Forgejo. I mean, it's probably excruciatingly obvious to those of you who do speak Spanish that I do not. Part of me wonders, couldn't we just call this thing Cody McStore my code face or something just to make Alex's life easier? Anyway, one of the reasons I decided to feature Forgejo today over, say, its historical parent project, Git is that the parent company of Forgejo, Codeberg, is a self-described democratic non-profit organization building a trusted, exclusively free software code forge. Now, you can, broadly speaking, think about Forgejo as a self-hostable clone of GitHub. Of course, a self-hostable code forge means that you're issuing the 150 million or so strong developer community that GitHub has and going it alone. And that can be a bug or a feature depending on your point of view, because that community makes GitHub what it is, that collaborative aspect, both a treasure and a potential long-term problem through homogenization of the developer ecosystem. But if what you are looking for is a private, secure, and locally hosted place to put your Git repos, not to mention something that lives on your own infrastructure to boot, then Forgejo may just be a great solution for you. Equally, it's really useful for small teams who want to collaborate privately. Now, Forgejo can do almost everything that GitHub itself can do: issues, workflows, of course, storing your code, and a whole lot more besides. But it also has some often overlooked nifty little features like automatic repository mirroring. This is really useful if you want to use this instance of Forgejo to back up a public repository every few hours in case it gets taken down through a DMCA request or whatever, or otherwise removed from the internet. It's really useful to back up your code as well. So I use this to actually mirror all of my GitHub repositories locally, just in case. So let's begin by spinning up an LXC on top of Proxmox. In fact, we've done this many times on the channel, and I'll put a link to a dedicated video I've made about this before up there. And you can find, as always, all the code snippets and everything that we need to actually deploy this project in the description down below, along with timestamps and chapters for you to find the bit of this video that makes the most sense for you. We can find the Forgejo project over at forgejo.org. And again, I apologize for the pronunciation there. I hope I'm getting it right. Forgejo. Maybe, we'll see. I'm sure the comments will tell me. Okay, so what we're going to do, first of all, you can see I've already got an instance here running on in an LXC 1001. Indeed, that's running on my tailnet at forgejo.velociraptor-needlefish. And you can see I've started to use it for a few things even. So let's say I want to back up a GitHub repository. Let's in fact use the one we're doing for this video. I'm going to come in here and grab the HTTPS URL that I have for this repo. Go across to, I nearly said Git, Freudian slip there, Forgejo, and do a new migration. You see all the options I've got here? I'm actually going to just select GitHub. It supports not only github.com, but also the self-hosted on-premise GitHub Enterprise version. So that could be useful if you're doing this at work, potentially. And then all you want to do is paste the URL in here for the clone URL. And sometimes you need to put an access token here for reasons. You can see right here. Now I want to select this repository will be a mirror. I don't have a wiki over here. And indeed, if I want to migrate all these other items to issues, pull requests, what have you, I need an access token. I'm not going to bother with that today. But the local clone of that repository in this instance is going to live under the user Zaphod, which is the main user I've created in this local instance of Forgejo. I'm just going to click on Migrate Repository. And before my very eyes, essentially what this does is it just does I suppose a git pull fetch like clone every, I think the default is every 8 hours or so. And if you want to change that, well, first of all, let's just take a moment and realize that we now have a fully local clone of this Tailscale dev repo infrastructure that I own and I control. And you can see it, broadly speaking, looks like a code forge, like I suppose a self-hosted GitHub, right? And we can see in here, you've got all this stuff. We've got all the branches. So for today's video, as I record, video Forgejo is in here, and there are all the different files we're going to get to in just a minute. But I mentioned a moment ago that you can configure the mirror settings, so you can configure how frequently this thing checks for updates, I suppose. And you can see that the default time here is every 8 hours. And of course, you can do a manual sync just here. So lots of things you can poke around with under the hood here. And I will also add that Forgejo supports self-hosted runners. So if you want to integrate this into a locally self-hosted CI/CD pipeline, you can absolutely do that using Forgejo. In fact, next week's, or certainly a video coming soon to the channel, will be part 2 of Forgejo, how to spin up self-hosted runners and connect them to your tailnet, so you can have fully offline CI/CD pipeline running across, well, it doesn't matter where the infrastructure is. It could be under my desk, it could be literally under your desk, and Tailscale will make a connection between the two. So that's a basic overview, I suppose, of Forgejo. It's basically a local GitHub, right? We're all familiar, I think, at this point, if you're watching this video at least, with the idea of a code forge. Now, what we want to do is spin up a brand new version and show you how to go about doing that. So like most projects on this channel, I'm going to reach for Docker to deploy this software, mostly because we can just use the Tailscale sidecar container method here to forward our SSH packets later on in order to have transparent SSH cloning working without having to specify a port number. It's a really nice little feature, which we'll get to in just a minute. But you can see here, as part of my standard Docker Compose file, I have the Tailscale stanza, right? This is just deploying the Tailscale/Tailscale image. And we are then deploying Forgejo itself next. So here you can see we're actually cloning it from the Docker repository that lives at codeberg.org. So Codeberg, of course, are the company behind, the non-profit behind Forgejo. So we're pulling that Docker image down from Codeberg directly, and then we're just linking it directly to the Tailscale container up here. So you see where it says service Forgejo TS. That's where this links together. So essentially, behind the scenes, we're merging the Linux networking namespace of these two containers together, but they still maintain entirely separate user spaces. So the package sets and everything else about the containers is entirely separate, but they're basically inside the same networking namespace. They have the same view of the network of the world inside the Linux kernel. You can see there's a few other things configured in here too, like the root URL. Well, I'm going to show you how we configure that in just a second. And then you've got some things like volumes to persist data outside the containers. And in our case, we don't actually need these ports because we're going to be using Tailscale serve to expose this container. So let's take a look first of all at how we configure things like the environment variables. That's these things here, the Forgejo host name. That word is going to trip me up all video, I'm sorry. And also how we configure the Tailscale auth key. So in this file here, the .env file, this is where we configure the auth key. Now, to generate an auth key, we have done this many times on the channel before, but I will not assume anything. Let's go over to our Tailscale admin console right here. You want to go to settings. I'm assuming you've already created a tailnet and you're already logged in, of course. You go to settings and then keys and then generate an auth key. I'm going to make mine reusable just in case I tear this up and down a few times in the purposes of making this video. You can add a tag if you want to. So if you want this Forgejo instance to only be available with a certain set of rules and parameters in your ACLs or your grants, this is where you would configure tags. Or you could even just make it an ephemeral node so that devices authenticated with this key get automatically removed when they go offline. I'm just going to leave this as the default except for reusable. I'm going to generate this key and then copy it to my clipboard. Once I put it on my clipboard, I will go back to VS Code and replace the value of TS auth key in my .env file. Now, you'll also want to make sure that your Tailscale suffix is updated, and how we do that is we go across to the admin console once again, and we go to DNS. We need to do a couple of things at this point. We have to make sure that Magic DNS is turned on, number 1, and the HTTPS certificates are turned on, number 2. And then from here, we can roll a new name for our tailnet. By default, every tailnet comes with a default name that looks something like this, like tail6e, blah, blah, blah. It's not very pretty. But we provide a list of tailnets you can roll, like a randomized roll, to pick something that has both a tail and scales. So in my case, a velociraptor and a noodlefish. Okay, so that's how we get that value right there. We just copy that to our clipboard, paste that in here, and we are good to go. Now, the only thing you've got left to change now is this option right here. So in my case, I've already got Forgejo on my tailnet, and I want to deploy another one just for demo. So I'm just going to call this Git. You call it whatever you want, but whatever it does, you have to make sure that it matches the name that is specified here. So this on line 5 is the name that the service will get when it is instantiated onto your tailnet. So this will be git.velociraptor-noodlefish.ts.net. Because we specify that in the env file in just one spot, we don't then need to update it in 2 spots in this file later on. Now, typically I eschew the .env option, the file option for specifying environment variables, because I don't find it makes a ton of sense to have one declarative file that is then dependent on another file elsewhere. And I know there are varying schools of thought on this particular topic, but for me at least, I like to just keep everything in the compose YAML file, because Forgejo itself has a huge number of environment variables that you can configure, and these all get passed through to the container underneath. So if you want to do a custom database, for example, you configure it through environment variables. If you want to change the app name, for example, you can change that in the environment variables too. When it starts to get beyond sort of 4 or 5 or 6 lines of this stanza here, that for me is when it starts to make sense to break it out into a separate file, and particularly if you're going to start reusing those values across multiple containers like you would do if you had the Forgejo app and a separate database. For me, this is a single user instance, so I'm just going to use the default SQLite database that Forgejo ships with, but it supports, I believe, Postgres and a bunch of other stuff too. Okay, so I think we're good to go with the compose YAML file. Next thing I want to do is explain to you how we're going to expose not only port 3000, but also port 22 securely to our tailnet transparently, so that folks can do a git clone using the Forgejo ts.net URL that we've created. So you'd have to specify a specific port. The magic sauce here today is this line, these 3 lines here, lines 3, 4, and 5. We're going to use TCPForward to forward from the local host inside the container. Remember, it's all sort of merged in the Linux kernel underneath in the networking namespace. So we're going to forward localhost port 22 using TCP forwarding to the localhost port 22. I know it's kind of confusing, but the traffic comes in over your tailnet and then gets redirected to localhost inside that container, which is also the same networking namespace in which Forgejo lives. So essentially all that happens is the traffic comes in over Tailscale, lands inside that container, and goes immediately to port 22 inside that networking namespace. And it just works. We then do the same thing with port 3000 to expose on the root of the subdomain the TS domain that you have. So what do we say? Git velociraptor-noodlefish.ts.net. This really is the magic sauce. I've seen for many years in compose files, I've had to expose ports like this, and then when I do git clone, I have to do git clone git at git.com, and then put port like this, and then repository, and then, or was it user, and then repo.git. Well, it might seem like a small detail to remove these few characters here, but what this means now is that by default, all the SSH traffic traverses port 22, which is exactly where it should be as part of a git clone operation. So it really makes the overall user experience much, much smoother. And now the final file that I have to show you today is the LXC configuration. This is a pretty standard Tailscale LXC configuration. All we really add to this file are these 3 lines right here. So let's make a start. Let's actually create ourselves a brand new LXC container at last. Let's do, I don't know, 1010 or something, and we're going to call this Git. It doesn't really matter what you call it, so long as it makes sense to you. And I'm going to go through next. I'm going to speed run this because I've done it many times on the channel before. 8 gig should be fine, although actually this is going to be hosting all of our Git data, isn't it? So Let's make it 50 gig just in case. A couple of CPUs, yeah, that should be fine. Anything intensive, remember, we're going to be doing with runners, which will have a hot... Well, I suppose you could run the runners inside this LXC if you wanted to, but separation of concerns, it might make sense to run the runners in a separate LXC. We'll get onto that later, don't worry about that, in a future video, not this one. Memory, 2 gig, totally fine. Network, yeah, we'll do DHCP. DNS, we're going to use the host settings, and then I'm not going to click start after created because I want to copy in these 3 lines into the configuration of the LXC that just got created. So back in Proxmox, I'm going to go to the node itself in question. PVE is the name of the node in question. And by the way, this is just running on one of those little 1 litre Dell PCs that I used for the self-hosting series a few weeks ago. It's just running on that rack just out of shot down there. So you really don't need much in the way of resources to do this. You know, you could do this on a Raspberry Pi if you wanted to. But we need to put these lines into our LXC configuration. So we go to etc/pve LXC, and then we'll do 1010.conf. Jump to the bottom of the file with Shift-G, press O to insert, or go into insert mode at the bottom, and then just paste these 2 lines in. This is so that Tailscale can run and bind to the DevNet TUN device. So now we can do PCT start 1010, followed swiftly by PCT exec 1010, and then I'm going to jump into bash inside that container. So we are now inside, look, you see the host name change to Git. We are now inside the LXC container. So if you want to think of it like a chroot or something like that, you can, if that helps you understand it better. But we are now inside the physical constraints of the LXC container Git with the ID 1010. So I want to do a few things now. I'm not on the host anymore, remember, so I've got to make sure that my package sets are all up to date with apt update and apt upgrade. The next thing I'm going to want to do is go to tailscale.com/download and download Tailscale from our website. Click on Linux and then copy this command to your clipboard and change back to the correct tab. When this has finished updating the packages, the next thing we're going to want to do is to install Tailscale. Now I know for a fact that Debian doesn't come out of the box with curl installed, so I'm going to install curl manually first with an apt install curl, and then I'm going to paste in the 1-line Tailscale install script. I then want to do the same thing with Docker, so I'm going to go to get.docker.com and verify that this script is what I think it is. It's the Docker install script. I'm just going to grab this URL right here, and I'm going to then modify the Tailscale install command because I kind of like just piping it to root like this. Now remember, there are some security concerns about piping things to root, random scripts from the internet, but we've literally just verified the contents of the get.docker script, so I think we're good to go. So we've installed Tailscale now, and we're going to install Docker next. Before we reboot, I want to get this node onto my tailnet. Now, I already had an auth key, remember, which I set to reusable. So I'm going to go back to my VS Code and go back to my env file and just grab this auth key right here, because I'm going to do Tailscale up. And last week I made a video about 7 things you can do with the Tailscale command line. I'll put a link to that one right up here. And I'm going to do Tailscale up --SSH and then --auth key. I think it's that, and then paste that in like that. And this is going to authenticate this node to my tailnet with no QR codes, with no clicking links and signing into things, just using my auth key to authenticate this node to Tailscale. As you can see, I can now do Tailscale status and I'm connected to my tailnet. How cool is that? Okay, before we go any further, I want to reboot the LXC to make sure any of the package changes that we made stick. And then just to make it a little clearer for you watching, I'm going to log into the container in its own separate shell rather than doing the exec kind of thing. So now the next thing I'm going to do is just verify that Docker is installed and working. Yes, hello from Docker. So we have Tailscale installed. We have Docker installed and running. We are now ready to go. And not only do we have Tailscale installed, we've got Tailscale with Tailscale SSH ready to go. Which brings me to my grand reveal. I have spent countless hours with Claude writing a little script here to make the deployment of this container as easy as I possibly could. So you want to change into the 2025-09 Forgejo directory. I'm already in that directory, as you can see. And then you really want to just run setup.sh and then git, or whatever the name of the node that you put in your tailnet was. So in my case, the name here of the machine is git. So I should, in fact, let me just test that by doing sudo root at git. So if I now do /setup.sh and then do git, this is going to go out over SSH and target the node on your tailnet named git. It's going to copy across the compose.yaml and the serve.json file, as well as the .env file. And now if we SSH to that remote node with SSH root at git, we can see that I can get in here, but also if I do ID Forgejo, there's now a brand new user created on this host too. Because one of the things that Forgejo doesn't like is trying to run as root. So we create inside the LXC a non-root user. And in fact, we can go there by doing su Forgejo. We also add this user to the Docker group. So if I can show you that here, this user is part of the Docker group. So we can just go into the containers directory that gets created, into the Forgejo directory that gets created, and do a Docker compose up. This is going to pull down the Tailscale Forgejo container and also the Forgejo app server container. It's going to instantiate the Tailscale one and put that container onto Tailnet, and then make the Forgejo container available on your Tailnet by virtue of being merged together with the network mode stanza as part of your compose file. And that really is all there is to it. You can see the app root URL here is set to git at velociraptor-noodlefish. We can see it doesn't work, and that's because I made a bit of an error earlier on. So I've accidentally ended up with two nodes here with kind of the same name, and I confused myself a little bit, and probably you in the process. So I'm going to leave this wart in the video, because you've told me in the past you like it when I show my working and show my mistakes, like my third grade maths teacher did. I've named the LXC container git. I've also named the Forgejo container git. And when Tailscale detects that, it puts two nodes on the tailnet, but it sort of numbers one of them. So I'm literally just going to rename the LXC to LXC git so that I know that this is kind of like the host. And then I'm going to rename the node that is the container that's running Forgejo just to git. And now I need to restart the applications underneath so that they pick up everything properly in terms of routing for Tailscale serve and what have you. And so now that I've renamed that node, what I want to do is go and click on the drop down here, click on this git.velociraptor-noodlefish, this is known as your fully qualified domain name, and paste that into my browser. And you can see I'm greeted with the default welcome script. Now, in the background, this may take a minute or two for the first time as it loads up the certs. You can see that it actually goes out and automatically does all of the TLS stuff. So it goes out to Let's Encrypt, generates the required certificates, and makes sure that you don't have to worry about any of that stuff, right? This just works magically in the background. Now you can see here that this is currently going to be titled Forgejo. Let's call this Tailscale's Awesome Git Server. And then we'll just leave all of this other stuff alone, except for where it says to create an administrator account. So username, I'm just going to pick Zaphod, and I don't think this is a real username, though if I ever meet anybody called Zaphod, I'll be like, your parents had good taste. And then I'm going to click on install Forgejo, and the application underneath is going to go away and do its thing. And you know, you might see in the logs it goes through and does a bunch of stuff in the background. That's good. Before too long, you'll be presented with a brand new, completely empty instance of Forgejo. So let's create a new repository and just call this one, I don't know, 1234. I'm going to initialize it with a blank file, an MIT license, because it's very important to have a license on an empty repo. And then I want to show you how here, because of the environment variables that we've set up in our compose file, namely the root URL and the SSH domain, we get the correct stuff here, and there's no extra ports have to be declared at all. So if I want to clone this repo now, I'm going to show you this will fail to start with, and that's by design. I'm going to go into this temp directory here where I clone all sorts of junk and put this in here, and it's going to fail because I haven't set up the SSH keys. Now, one of the things I was hoping to be able to do as part of this video was reuse the Tailscale identity and Tailscale SSH to do that as part of SSH clones. Unfortunately, that would have involved some upstreaming of a bunch of stuff, and I just didn't have the time to do that as part of this video. So for now, I suppose it's still not that terrible of a situation. We're just going to have to use the existing SSH keys that we have for our nodes. Now you can see this is my public SSH key, and I'm going to put this on my clipboard on macOS by piping it to pb copy. Much like you would do on GitHub, I'm going to go to the user, Zaphod, and settings, and then SSH keys. When I put that in here, it's going to detect that it's for Baldric, which is this laptop on the desk in front of me. I'm going to add this key. Now, when I go back and try and clone this repo again, you'll see that it just works. So what's happening there is the SSH stuff comes from this laptop, goes out over Tailscale, admittedly just to the computer behind me in this rack just behind me. But I could take this laptop anywhere in the world right now and then still clone with no extra port configuration, no reverse proxies, no ports open in my firewall, none of that. And I can just clone stuff over Tailscale from my locally self-hosted Forgejo instance. It is wonderful, and it's a really simple thing to have your own self-hosted Git Forge, but why not? We can. Self-hosting's never been easier to get into, and I hope today's video, as a little bit involved as it was with some of the stuff with spinning up the LXC and renaming things, I hope today's video gave you another taste of some of the things you can do with Tailscale and how you can own your own data and be in full control of everything that's going on. There's no business model at play here other than, you know, Forgejo and Codeberg's non-profit business model. It's you own it, right? This ostensibly you could continue to run this piece of software until the end of time in its current guise. I mean, the world around it would move on and eventually it would become a problem, but certainly for many years you can standardize around self-hosted software and it will just keep trucking, it will just keep working. So if you haven't already, by the way, I highly encourage you to go over to our brand new Discord server at discord.gg/tailscale. Our wonderful community over there is growing by the day. We're going to have live streams and all sorts of community hangouts over the coming weeks. So please go over there, join discord.gg/tailscale. Now, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, I've been Alex from Tailscale.